B'siyata d'shmaya, we're going to learn Moed Katan Daf. We're going to start from the very top of the Amud. Says the Gemara, "Hahedyoit toifer kedarkoi," and this takes us back to the Mishnah on Daf Ches Amud Beis, where the Mishnah said that a hedyot, an amateur, unskilled person, is allowed to sew on Chol HaMoed kedarkoi in his regular way. V'ho'uman, says the Mishnah, a skilled person has to be machliv, and we'll soon see what that means. But it means he has to do it in an unusual way, in an unprofessional way. Heichadami hedyot. What defines whether somebody's sewing skills are unskilled? So the Gemara says, Amri debei Rabbi Yanai, kol she'eino yochei lahoitzi meloi machat bevas achas. The skilled people, they could actually do the whole length of a needle of stitches in one go. So somebody who cannot draw a whole needle full of stitches at a time before pulling the needle out of the material, then he's not called a professional and skilled person who knows how to sew. Rabbi Yossi ber Chanina Omar, kol she'eino yochel lechavein imra bechapas chalukoi. Anybody who cannot, when he's sewing a hem at the bottom of a cloak, if he cannot make an even hem at the bottom of the cloak, then he's clearly an unskilled person for sewing, and he can sew on Chol HaMoed in his regular way. Says the Gemara, however, a skilled person who knows how to sew machliv, he has to sew with a shinui in an unusual way on Chol HaMoed. My machliv, what's the definition of machliv? How does one sew in an unusual way? Rabbi Yochanan Omar mafsia. Rabbi Yochanan says that he makes the stitches very wide. Rabbi Bar Shmuel Omar shinei kalbasa, that he should sew but very uneven stitches. One a little bit up, a little bit down, uneven stitches, and that means not in a completely straight line. It's called shinei kalbasa because the literal translation is the teeth of a dog, and a dog's teeth, they happen also to be wide apart, but also they are not regular, they're not even. If one sews in that way, then one's clearly sewn in an unusual way. Continues the Gemara, Mesargin es hamitois. And this takes us back to the final statement in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says that the Tanna Kama, and we'll soon see that it's Reb Meir, holds that Mesargin es hamitois, one's allowed to weave, to interlace the beds. Rabbi Yossi Omer mematchin, Rabbi Yossi says that one's only allowed to be mematchin, which will translate for now to tighten the ropes. Now, to understand the next Gemara, we have to understand how they would make beds. In the olden days, then, they would have, they would have korim v'kisos, they would have bedding, they would have what we would call pillows, maybe even a mattress, but what would be the base of the bed? The base of the bed would be a frame on 4 legs, and the frame, which was just possibly a wooden frame, but in the middle of it, what's holding the mattress up? Then there would be ropes that would go lengthways, called the chassis, and going across, which was called the erev. In English, that would be vertical and horizontal. The chassis is the vertical, it's going lengthways of the bed, and the erev, the horizontal, is going from side to side. And typically they would put the lengthways, they would put the ropes, but in order to strengthen it, they would then interweave within the chassis, they would interweave the erev, the horizontal, the crosswise, those ropes. So the question is, what are you allowed to do on Chol HaMoed? If you need this bed, and you haven't got a bed to sleep on, it's a discussion in the Mefarshim, what are you allowed to do with this bed? Now, there's a number of different stages. You've got the stage of actually twisting the ropes, preparing the ropes themselves. That would be the most effort. Then below that would be positioning on the bed, on the frame, the chassis v'erev, the crisscross. That means those, what we'd call the batim, the boxes made of the lengthways and the crossways, that they would put these ropes. Even less effort than that is putting just the chassis, just the lengthways. They would put just those ropes in order to hold up the mattress where the person is sleeping. So that's the question, what are you allowed to do? So we saw in the Mishnah that Reb Meir says, the Tanna Kama says, you're allowed to even be mesargin. Rabbi Yossi says in the Mishnah, no, you're only allowed to be mematchin. The mematchin, that means what the stage even less than shesi would be just to be tight, just to tighten the ropes. They're all there, but they're sagging a little bit. It's not so comfortable to sleep like that. So you could just fill up the sag with some clothes and then the mattress will lie flat. But if you didn't want to do that and you wanted to tighten those ropes, then that would be another discussion. So all we see in the Mishnah is that we have that the Tanakhama say Masargin, and Rabbi Yossi says not Masargin, just Mematchin. We have to see, what does Masargin mean? What does Mematchin mean? Says the Gemara, My Masargin umay Mematchin. What does Masargin mean, which Rabbi Meir allows, the Tanakhama allows, and what's Mematchin, which Rabbi Yossi allows? Ki also Rav Dimi, when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, Omar, he said that Pligi bar Reb Chia bar Abba v'Reb Asi. It's a machlekes Reb Chia bar Abba and Reb Asi. V'tarvayu mishmei de Chizkiya v'Reb Yechanan. And they both said it in the name of Chizkiya and Reb Yechanan. Chad Omar, one of them said that Masargin, what does it mean Masargin that the Tanakhama allow? That means positioning Shesi v'Erev, the lengthwise ropes and the crosswise ropes. U'Mematchin. What does it mean Mematchin that Rabbi Yossi allows? Is Shesi b'loy Erev, is just to put the lengthways ropes, those you can position, without afterwards weaving through them the crossways ropes. That was one opinion. V'chad Omar. The other opinion was Masargin that the Tanakhama allow is not Shesi v'Erev. Nobody allows Shesi v'Erev according to this opinion. What Masargin means, Shesi b'loy Erev. If you're only putting the long ways ropes on the bed, then you're allowed to do that. Rabbi Yossi says even that not. What are you allowed to do? Mematchin. Or Mematchin, what's Mematchin? Shem hoya rofui, that if they were loose, Mematcha, you can tighten the existing ropes, but you cannot position any new ropes. Says the Gemara, Eini v'atanya of Tachlifa bar Shol. We have an issue here. Did Rav Tachlifa bar Shol not say that V'shavin, that everybody agrees, also Reb Meir and also Rabbi Yossi, both opinions of our Mishnah, both agree, she'ein mafshilin chavolim lekatchila, that you're not allowed to twist these ropes. To start with, new ropes, you're not allowed to twist them, and that's even more effort than Shesi v'Erev. So Bishlei Milamando Omar, according to the first opinion that says that Reb Meir, who says that you're allowed to do Masargin, is Shesi v'Erev, the Omar Masargin is Shesi v'Erev, and Mematchin, which Rabbi Yossi says you're allowed to do is Mematchin, is Shesi b'loy Erev, then I can understand. Hainu Diktoni of Tachlifa bar Shol, I can understand that Rav Tachlifa would say that V'shavin, they both agree, even Reb Meir, who says you're allowed to do Shesi v'Erev, he'll agree that She'ein mafshilin chavolin lekatchila, you're not allowed to twist ropes in the first place, because it's even more effort than Shesi v'Erev, then positioning the two ropes. According to that second opinion, that holds that Masargin, that the most you can do, which is the Tanakhama say Masargin, and even that is only Shesi b'loy Erev. You're only allowed to put the lengthways ropes, you're not even allowed to intertwine the crossways ropes. And so if Shesi v'Erev is not allowed, then of course you're not allowed to twist ropes, which is even a bigger effort on Chol HaMoed. So according to this person, the Man Da'oma, who says Masargin Shesi b'loy Erev, and Mematchin means She'im hoya rofui, that if the ropes were loose, hoya mematchi, you're allowed to tighten them. Hashta Shesi v'Erev omras loy, if you both agree that Shesi v'Erev, just positioning them, is more effort than you're allowed to do in Chol HaMoed, chavolin lekatchila miboya, you can take it for granted that you're not allowed to twist new ropes on Chol HaMoed. So why did Rav Tachlifa bar Shol have to say that you're not allowed to twist the ropes? He could have said for the same price, you're not even allowed to position already twisted ropes, Shesi v'Erev, because even Reb Meir doesn't allow that according to this second opinion. Says the Gemara Kashya, indeed it's a question which the Gemara is not giving us an answer to. Continues the Gemara, Omale Rav Nachman bar Yitzchok Reb Chia bar Avin. Mi'ika leman de Omar Masargin Shesi b'loy Erev. Could there be, which is the second opinion we saw before, that the word Masargin actually means just putting on the Shesi without the Erev? What none this seems to contradict the Mishnah Masechet Kelim. The Mishnah in Kelim determines when a bed is considered as finished, as being made, and from this point it's got the status of a vessel and it can contract tumah. So Reb Meir says, Hamito, when is a bed considered finished? Misha Yisroig. You note that he's using the term Yisroig, which is the same word as now Mishnah of Masargin. But he says, what does it mean, Misha Yisroig? Misha Yisroig ba shloisha batim. From the point that you've crossed the Shesi and the Erev 3 times, so now you have 3 boxes, so to speak, which is the areas between the Shesi ropes and the Erev ropes, then that's considered that the bed is now finished. It's now considered a kli. So you see clearly that Yisroig means Shesi and Erev. If you only do Shesi, you're not going to have batim, you're not going to have boxes there. You're just going to have the ropes. So you see clearly that the word Yisroig, which is interlaced, means Shesi and Erev. And this is contradicting the second opinion we saw before, that when the Tana Kama in the Mishnah say that Masargin, the second opinion says it's Shesi b'loi Erev. Eloki also Rovin, when Rovin came to Bovel, Omar, he said as follows, that by Masargin, everybody agrees that the definition of Masargin which the Tana Kama allow, Kule al maloi pligi de Shesi v'erev. All opinions hold it's Shesi v'erev. Eloki pligi, where's the Tana Kama and Rabbi Yossi arguing? B'mamatchin. They're only arguing, what does mamatchin mean? Marasovar, one opinion says mamatchin means Shesi b'loi erev, that Rabbi Yossi allows to put the Shesi as long as you don't also put the Erev afterwards. Or Marasovar, and the other opinion says Shim Hoya Rofui, that you're not even allowed to place the Shesi ropes. That if all the ropes are there and they've just become a little bit sagged, a little bit loose, Mamatcho, you're allowed to tighten them. So, and if so, you've got no opinion that says that Masargin is not Shesi and Erev. Asks the Gemara Meisvei, Masargin es amito. The Brisa says that you're allowed to be Masargin the bed, and it goes without saying you can be mateach the bed. That is the opinion of Reb Meir. Rabbi Yossi argues and says no. So far it's exactly the same as our Mishnah. Tana Kama say Masargin and Rabbi Yossi says mematchin. But here you've got another opinion, a yesh oimrim, which is a third opinion we haven't seen yet. Ein mematchin kol ikka. You're not even allowed to be mematchin. So now we have to understand, we just saw there's a machlokas, what is mamatchin? Is mamatchin just placing the Shesi rope, or is mamatchin just tightening the existing ropes on the bed? So the Gemara is saying, Bishlei melemand omar mamatchin Shesi b'loi Erev, if mamatchin means that you're placing the Shesi ropes without the Erev, Hainu da'osu yesh oimrim, I can understand that the yesh oimrim will come and say, le'ifluge and argue, and say that it's too much effort, you're not even allowed to place the Shesi. Elo lemanda omar, but according to the opinion that says that what is mamatchin, shem hoyarofui mamatchui, that if the existing ropes are a little bit loose, you can tighten them. Liyesh oimrim mamatchui nami loy. Is it possible that somebody should suggest that you're not allowed to even just tighten these ropes? That's hardly any effort at all. Why should that be asa? And you have nowhere to sleep. At least just tighten the ropes. It's a minimal amount of effort to be able to sleep. Says the Gemara I can understand that opinion would say, don't tighten the ropes. Why? Because I've got another option without needing to tighten the ropes. Since the sagging of these ropes, when the ropes that are a bit too low can be filled up with garments, lo torchinon, and therefore better just put some garments in the middle of the bed to straighten it out, rather than starting to go into the effort of tightening the existing ropes. And therefore the Yesh Oimrim and the Brisa say you shouldn't even be memateach to tighten the ropes on Chol HaMoed. Continues the next Mishnah. Ma'amidin, one's allowed to set up tanur v'kiraim, which is an oven, a stove. So Rashi explains that a tanur typically has space for 2 pots, and a kira has space for just 1 pot, but it's types of ovens and stoves. You're allowed to set them up on Chol HaMoed. V'rechaim, and also millstones. Millstones, how does a mill work? You have a stone at the bottom, which is fixed. You have a stone on top, which goes round. There's grooves, we're going to soon see what they are, but there are grooves in the lower stone that catch the the kernels, the grains that are poured through a hole in the top stone. So the grains the kernels are poured through the eye of the top stone. They reach the lower stone, and then you've got the grooves in the lower stone that catch these kernels, and then the mills, the stones get grind. They would turn the upper stone, and then the kernels of wheat or barley, whatever it would be, would get ground in between the stones. You're allowed to set up tanur v'kiraim and erechaim millstones b'moed and chol hamoed. Rabbi Yehuda says, Ein mechabshin es harechaim b'tchila. We'll have to see in the Gemara exactly what the word mechabshin means, but whatever this mechabshin is, that to do it initially for the first time on the millstones, that you're not allowed to do on chol hamoed, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Says the Gemara, my mechabshin. When it says in the Mishnah that Rabbi Yehuda says, Ein mechabshin es harechaim b'tchila, that you're not allowed to initially be mechabshin the millstones, what does it mean? Two explanations in the Gemara. Rav Yehuda says, menake rechaya. It means these cutting grooves. They would make these grooves into the lower stone. Rav Yehuda says you're not allowed to do that initially. Rav Yechiel argues and says, you know what it means mechabshin, or in mechabshin, bas eina. It means making the eye, this eye hole, cutting an eye hole into the upper stone of the millstones in order to pour the grains through them. You're not allowed to do that on chol hamoed. It's more effort than the Chachomim allowed. Asks the Gemara against Rabbi Yechiel, meisvei from a brisa. Ma'amidin tanur v'kirayim, one's allowed to set up an oven and a stove, and you obviously have to add in here the v'rechaim, as Rabbi Kiva and other Mefarshim say, because the brisa is about to discuss the millstones. You're allowed to set up an oven, a stove, and the millstones on chol hamoed. But it has to be something irregular, something different, a shinui, because it's chol hamoed, so make sure you don't complete the work. Divrei Rabbi Eliezer, that's the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. The Chachomim say you can even complete the work. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, Ma'amidin es hachadosha, you're allowed to set up in the new millstones. Umechabshin es hayeshana. And if it's not the new millstones, you're allowed to do the mechabshin. V'yesh oimrim, and others say, ein mechabshin kol ika. Others say you're not allowed to do mechabshin at all, even on old stones. So now the Gemara is explaining. If you say mechabshin is menake rechaya, is these cutting grooves, I can understand. You make the grooves in the new stones, but sometimes after you've been milling and grinding long enough, then these grooves get worn out a little bit, and then you have to just deepen them a little bit and add some more grooves, and that's called a yeshana. You do that. So there's a discussion here whether you're allowed to only add these grooves on an old millstones or even on the new millstones for the first time. Are you allowed to make these grooves? Then if the word mechabshin were to mean the grooves, as Rav Yehuda said, we can understand that they apply to an old mill and a new mill. But according to Rav Yechiel, the Omar Bas Eino, that says that the mechabshin means making this eye hole in the top stone through which they would pour the grains. Yeshono bas eino lomola. How can you have an old millstone that you need to make this hole in? If it never had a hole till now, you couldn't grind with it. It must have had a hole. And once it's got a hole, why do you need to make a hole? Says the Gemara, no. Even according to Bichil, he could explain the brisa. If you want to widen that eye hole a little bit, that's the discussion, according to Rabbi Yechiel, if you're allowed to do that or not. So B'chadasha would mean making a hole in the first place. B'yeshana means widening it a little bit, which is not so much tircha, and that's the discussion in the brisa. Continues the Gemara. Rav Huna shomei lahu gavra. Rav Huna heard that there was this person that he was doing this mechabshin of Rav Yehuda. He was making the cutting grooves in the stones on chol hamoed. And Omar, so Rav Huna responded about this person, Man hai, who's this person who is desecrating the chol hamoed by making the grooves? Rav Huna obviously holds you're not allowed to make these grooves on chol hamoed. And he said, Itachil gufei, that his body of this person should become desecrated to kamochil chol hamoed, because he is desecrating the chol hamoed. Sovar lo. Obviously, Rav Huna holds ki yesh oimrim, like those opinions that say ein mechabshin kol ikka, that you're not allowed to do the mechabshin at all on Chol HaMoed. Even on any millstones, you're not allowed to do that. That's how Rav Huna held. Dorash Rav Choma. Rav Choma taught, Noikrin Rechayim b'Moed. You are allowed to be menakir, you're allowed to make these cutting grooves on Chol HaMoed, and he doesn't say only on old millstones. It seems that even on a new millstone you'd be allowed to. Another halacha mishum Reb Meir Omar. He said in the name of Reb Meir, Afilu sus sharoichiv olav, v'chamor sharoichiv olav, even the horse that he's riding on, the donkey he's riding on, that is one's umuta little tzipornaim, one is allowed to trim their hooves b'chol shel moed, because if you're riding on on the donkey, on the horse, on Chol HaMoed, and you don't trim the hooves, it's going to be a pain for the animal, and it won't be able to walk properly. And Tosfos brings here that you're only allowed to ride an animal on Chol HaMoed l'tzorech HaMoed, and it's a discussion. But that's what the Gemara said here in the name of Reb Meir. And the Bach says that it's not Reb Meir, it says that it's actually Rav. Aval, Chamra Derechayo, a mill donkey, the donkey that was used to turn the mills, you're not allowed to trim the hooves of that donkey. Why? Because you're only allowed to grind on Chol HaMoed, and we're going to see this on Daf Yud Beis, you're only allowed to grind enough to have flour to bake and to cook on Yom Tov. So you only need a little bit. So you only need to grind a little bit. To grind just a little bit, the donkey that is driving round the millstones only has to walk around it a little bit for that little bit of flour, and for that it can do even with its hooves not trimmed. Rav Yehuda Shori leMishkal Turfei lechamra derechaya. Rav Yehuda argued and said you're allowed to trim the hooves of this donkey that was turning the mills. And he says you're allowed to set up the millstones, and you're allowed to build a mill, amas, and you're allowed to build the frame on which the amas rechaya, the frame on which the millstones were built on, were positioned, and one's allowed to build a barn on Chol HaMoed. Rava, others say it's Rav, Shara l'sruke susya. He says that on Chol HaMoed you're even allowed to comb the horses with metal combs. You're allowed to do that on Chol HaMoed, even though you might be pulling out some of its hair, but it's important for the horses on Chol HaMoed to look presentable. Ulemivnei akarpita. And you're allowed to also build on Chol HaMoed a feeding trough for the animals, for the horses, ulemivne itztaba, and you're allowed to build a stone bench that you need on Chol HaMoed, you're allowed to build that on Chol HaMoed. And now the Gemara is going to list out 8 different statements from Rava on the halachas of Chol HaMoed. Rava, first statement, Rava shara lemishkal doma lebehema b'chola demoyado. Rava says one's allowed to one's allowed to draw blood from an animal on Chol HaMoed. Omale Abaya. Abaya said, Tani de Messiah loch, I'll bring you a brisa that backs up your position, Rava. That says in the brisa, Mekizin dam lebehema, you're allowed to let blood, which was a medical procedure done back in the days. You're allowed to do that with an animal, to an animal on Chol HaMoed. Ve'in moinin refuah lebehema, we do not withhold any medical treatment from an animal, b'chol shel moed, on Chol HaMoed. Second statement of Rava, Rava shori lechiskuse kirmi. Rava says you're allowed to press clothes on Chol HaMoed. My time, and what would be the reason for that? Because Masechet Moed, it's just an amateur act, and it's nothing skilled or professional about it, and therefore you're allowed to do it on Chol HaMoed. Omar of Yitzchok bar Ami, Omar of Chizda, it was said in the name of Rav Chizda that kiturei biri osor, which means pleating a sleeve on Chol HaMoed is not allowed. My tama, my se'umanhu, the reason is because it is the work of a craftsman. You need to be more professional to be able to pleat the sleeves, and therefore you're not allowed to do that on Chol HaMoed. Omar Rava, another third statement of Rava. Man de matkil ara, for somebody who's removing stones from the ground, so he's digging up a little bit of the ground to remove the stones, then it depends what his intention is. Adaita de beidori, if he's doing it to prepare a threshing floor, to thresh the produce that he needs for Yom Tov, shari, that's allowed. However, adaita de ara, if you're doing it to cultivate the land, to prepare it to be able to plow and to sow and to plant in the ground, also you're not allowed to do that on Chol HaMoed. Heichedomi, how would you know? What will determine if you're doing it just to prepare a threshing floor or if you're doing it to cultivate the land? So he says like this, and we're going to explain this according to how Rashi explains it and the Bach writes into the Gemara. That mulya b'mulya, if you take some earth on top of a mound and you place it on top of a mound, v'nitze b'nitze, and you have a hole, and you're making one hole and putting it from one hole into another hole, that means you're not flattening the land. Whatever was a hole, there's as many holes as there were before as there are afterwards. There's as many mounds afterwards as before. Then it's adaita de ara. Then we can assume that the reason you're doing it is, if it's not to level the ground, you're doing it just to cultivate it and to start, similar to ploughing, where you don't care how level the ground is. And that's not allowed. However, shokil mulya v'shoda b'nitze, if you're taking earth from a mound and putting it into a cavity, into a hole, then you've leveled out the ground. What would you be leveling out the ground? Shokil mulya v'shoda b'nitze, then adaito de beidori. Then we can assume that your intention is just in order to have a smooth and flat threshing ground, and that you're allowed to do on Chol HaMoed. The fourth statement of Rava, v'omar Rava, Haiman de zichi zichi. If somebody is clearing away the twigs, the debris, the woods from the ground, then are you allowed to do that on Chol HaMoed? It depends. Adaita de tzivi, if you're doing it in order to collect wood because you need for fuel, firewood, shari, then you're allowed to do that. Chol HaMoed, you need it for Chol HaMoed. Adaita de Arab, if you're doing it again just to prepare the land for ploughing, then also that's not allowed. Heichadomi, what would determine what your intentions are? Shokil ravrava v'shovik zutra, if you only take the big twigs and the big branches and you leave the small ones, adaita de tzivi, then it's clear that you want it for firewood, and that you're allowed to do. Shokil ravrava v'zutri, but if you're clearing away all the twigs and branches that are in the way, the big ones and the small ones, then adaita de ara, you're clearly preparing the land to cultivate it for the planting, and that you're not allowed to do on Chol HaMoed. The fifth statement of Rava, v'omar Rava, Haiman de potach maya la'ari, if somebody opens an opening in order for the water to pour into his field, into his land, are you allowed to do that on Chol HaMoed? Again, it depends. Adaita de kavri, if you want the water to fill up the cavity and the fish should come in with the water, and then you're doing it in order to catch fish. Catching fish, to be able to eat fish for Chol HaMoed and for Yom Tov, there's nothing wrong with that. Shari, it's mutter. Adaita de ara, but if you're doing it in order to water and to irrigate the land, osir, it's osir. Again, it's talking about a field, assuming that it's a field you're not allowed to irrigate on Chol HaMoed. Heichadomi, what would determine what your intentions are with this water? So he says, Posach trei bovi, if this cavity that's catching the water, if you opened up two entrances, one to let the water in and one to let the water out of this cavity, with just the fish being caught inside this ditch, then you're clearly doing it to catch the fish. Pasach trei bovi, if you open two openings, chad me'iloy v'chad mitatoy, one higher up and one lower down, then adate de kavri, you're clearly doing it with intentions of catching the fish. Pasach chad bova, if you open just one opening and then the cavity, this ditch, fills up and then overflows into and waters the entire field, it's clearly adaita da'ara. It's in the intentions of watering and irrigating the entire field, and that's not allowed on Chol HaMoed. The sixth statement of Rava, v'omar Rava, Haiman de poshach dikla, if somebody removes some branches from a palm tree, again it depends what his intention is. Adaita de cheva, so if he's doing it in order to feed his animals with these branches, shari, it's allowed. Adaita de dikla, if he's doing it just in order to improve the quality of this tree, also you're not allowed to do that on Chol HaMoed. Heichadomi, again, what would determine what his intentions are? is as follows: Shokil kule mechad gisa. If everything you take off is just on one side of the tree, you take dry branches and you take the more softer, the fresher branches, all from one side of the tree. The Shokil kule takes all of the branches mechad gisa from one side of the tree. Adaita de chivusa. He's obviously doing it in order to feed his animals with these branches. However, if he's picking out the dry branches mehai gisa and taking the dry branches mehai gisa from the other side, then clearly adaita de dikla. He's pulling off the dried branches in order to improve the tree. V'asar, that's asar and chol hamoed. The seventh statement of Rava, v'omar Rava, hani tamre tuchlani. You have these unripe dates. Migzarinu, you're allowed to cut them into two on chol hamoed. Shari, if you're doing it just to cut them into two on chol hamoed in order to eat them, then you're allowed to do that. However, maitzinu, if you want to press these dates, and they would typically press the dates before letting them dry out, because if there's too much liquid in them, they could get wormy. If it's too moist, and in order to, but pressing these dates, also that you're not allowed to do. And about cutting dates, the Chazon Ish already discusses what should be the issue with cutting dates. Why does the Gemara have to tell us that it's mutter? But either way, that's how Rashi explains this Gemara, that regarding these tamri tuchlani, these unripe dates, it depends what you're doing with them. Pressing them on chol hamoed is asar, cutting them to eat is mutter. Rav Papa Omar, Rav Papa argued and said no. Given the mitli, since if they remain moist, they could get wormy, then it's similar to prakmatya ha'ove domi. It's like merchandise, it's like business, which is something that in the event that you would incur a loss by not doing it on chol hamoed, you're allowed to do it on chol hamoed. So too these dates, if you don't press them to remove the moist from them, the liquid from them, they could get wormy and then you lose them. The shari, therefore, it's mutter to do it on chol hamoed. V'omar Rava, the eighth and last statement from Rava, prakmatya, which is buying and selling of merchandise on chol hamoed, kol shehu asur. Any amount of buying and selling on chol hamoed is asur. Omer b'yosi bar ovin, u'b'dava ha'ovid. However, if you don't sell it now on chol hamoed, it's going to incur loss. Not that you're not going to have the gains. The gains you'll have afterwards when you sell them after Yom Tov, after chol hamoed. But if you're going to lose by not selling them on chol hamoed, mutter, then it's allowed. Continues the Gemara. Ravina havale hahu iska. Ravina had this business opportunity. The hava mizdavein, that he could have sold his merchandise, his wares, on chol hamoed b'shita alpha for 6,000 zuz. Shihya, he waited till after Yom Tov. Lizvune basa chol hamoed. He said, I don't want to sell on chol hamoed. He waited till after chol hamoed, v'zavne, and he managed to sell them b'treise alpha for 12,000 zuz. For twice the price of what they would have been worth had he sold it on chol hamoed. You never lose by following the Torah. Continues the Gemara. Rava have a mosik zuzi. There was a time that Rava had a claim of some coins of zuzi from the people of B'bnei Akra de Shanuasa, the people who lived in the vicinity of this river Shanuasa. He wanted to know, can I go to those people who owe me money and claim the money on chol hamoed? Asala kamei de Ravashi. So Ravina, before setting out, he asked Ravashi. Omar le, Ravashi said to Ravina, Ma'u, and Ravina asked Ravashi, Ma'u lemeiza lo idna alayu. What's the halacha regarding going today to this people of Akra de Shanuasa to ask for my money back? Omar le, Ravashi said to Ravina, Kivan de ha'idna hu de mishkachaslu. Today you know exactly where these people are, you would be able to find them. B'yoyim achrina, if you wait for another day, there's a good chance you're not going to find those people. And therefore it's kaprakmatya ha'ove domi. It's similar to business transactions where you would incur a loss if you didn't do it on chol hamoed, v'shari, and it's mutter. Similarly, Tani, we learned in a brayse nami gabe avodah zara. Regarding avodah zara, ki hai gavna, we found something similar. That what? That hoilchin le'yerid shel akum. You're allowed to go to a fair, a pagan fair, a fair that is run by people who serve avodah zara. V'loichim beheiman, you're allowed to buy from them animals, avodim, and slaves, shvachis, maidservants, botim, houses, sodis, fields, kromim, vineyards. And v'koisav, you're allowed to write down the transactions, or maile be'erkois shalohem, and record it in their courts. Even though going to their courts is giving prestige and prominence to their courts, and that's something that you're clearly not allowed to do unless you would be incurring a loss. But mipneishu kamatzil miyadon, if you don't go immediately and record the transactions in the courts, then afterwards the goyim could play tricks on you, and you could lose what you've bought. And therefore, this is in the same way as Hilchas Chol HaMoed. If there's a one-off opportunity to secure that you don't incur a loss, you're allowed to do it on Chol HaMoed. So too, when it comes to buying from these goyim, you're allowed to go to their courts, and because it's kamatzel miyadom, because otherwise you may risk losing what you've bought. That's how Rashi explains this Gemara. The Ritva explains it a little bit differently. He says that the chiddush here is that you're actually allowed to go and buy from them in these fairs, in these sales. Normally one wouldn't be allowed to buy from the Avodah Zaros, from the people who serve Avodah Zarah. But since you could lose money because they're very cheap prices, then you're allowed to go and buy them. That's how the Ritva explains this. Continues the Gemara, Rav Shoro Lechia Bar Ashi, Rav allowed Chia Bar Ashi lemigdal to craft oihare, fish traps, b'choyle demeado on Chol HaMoed. My tama, why was that allowed? Masechet, because making a fish trap is an amateur act, and you're allowed to do that on Chol HaMoed. Avol izli, Osur. However, to make birds' nets, that's Osur. My tama, why is it Osur? Maise umenhu. Because it's the act of a craftsman, and craftsman skilled work is not allowed to be done on Chol HaMoed. Continues the Gemara. Rav Yehuda shori le'ami tanura. Rav Yehuda allowed Ami, the oven maker, lemigdal to craft tanurei, to craft a new oven on Chol HaMoed. Rabbi Bar Isvi, and Rav Yehuda allowed Rabbi Bar Isvi lemigdal to craft mahulta, sieves that he needed for Chol HaMoed. He was allowed to do that on Chol HaMoed. Asks the Gemara, Eini v'atani Rabbi Bar Shmuel v'shoven she'im goydlin tanu l'katchila. How could you say that Rabbi Yehuda allowed Ami Tanura to craft a new oven on Chol HaMoed? Did we not learn in a Braisa, or did we not learn that Rabbi Bar Shmuel said that you're not allowed to craft a new oven on Chol HaMoed? Says the Gemara, Lo kasha. It's not a question. Can be a mois hachama, that in the winter, in the summer, in the summer times, that as soon as you make the oven, it will dry very quickly, and you'll actually be able to use the oven still on Chol HaMoed for the sake of Chol HaMoed and Yom Tov, and therefore you're allowed to make such an oven. Can be mois hagashomim. But when it says that v'shovin she'ein goydlin tanur l'katchila, you're not allowed to craft a new oven, it's talking about the Chol HaMoed in the winter times. That's the Sukkot one. In the summertime is Pesach Chol HaMoed, and Chol HaMoed Sukkot is typically more rainy, and because it's more rainy, it's colder, it's not going to dry as quickly, and the oven's not going to be ready, and then you'll have exerted effort on Chol HaMoed shelei l'tzorech haregel, not for the sake of Yom Tov. You can't use this oven; it's not going to dry quick enough to be able to be used on for the sake of Chol HaMoed and Yom Tov, and therefore you're not allowed to craft such an oven on Chol HaMoed. And in the next Shiur, we're going to learn the next Mishnah.